Good afternoon. My name is Paul Rudensky. I am the Senior Director for Education here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm pleased to welcome all of you today to today's program, which is the first of a series of 3 lectures entitled The Experiences of Jewish Women in the Holocaust. In Holocaust studies, as in other fields, recognition of the importance of women's experience is a comparatively recent development. During the Holocaust, women, of course, were victims as well, but in many cases, their experiences were different. Women often had new roles, they had vulnerabilities that men did not have, and they also had advantages that men lacked. We will be inspired by the courage, determination, and resourcefulness of Jewish women during this horrible time in history. We will also be inspired by how many of those who survived rebuilt their lives and their families. By exploring this fascinating history, we will develop a fuller, richer picture of the experience of Jewish people in the Holocaust. Today's lecture is entitled Mothers, Sisters, Resistors, Jewish Women in the Holocaust, and it will be an overview of the entire topic. The next lecture in the series is on Sunday, February 21st, and is entitled The Camp Sister Phenomenon, a Ray of Hope in the Concentration Camp. The last lecture is on February 28th and will be on Jewish women, Jewish identity, and the Jewish response to the Holocaust. I hope you will join us for all 3 sessions. Let me tell you about our speaker, Bonnie Gurewitsch. Ms. Gurewitsch was an archivist and curator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage until she retired in 2013. She has been a Holocaust educator and oral historian since the 1970s. She curated special exhibitions at the museum, including Arts to Fight For American Jews in the Second World War, Daring to Resist, Jewish Defiance in the Holocaust, Beyond Swastika and Jim Crow, Jewish Refugee Scholars at Black Colleges, and Against the Odds, American Jews and the Rescue of Europe's Refugees, 1933 to 1941. Ms. Gurewitsch has advised several scholarly and educational projects, including the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. She is currently an advisor to the Heritage Testimonies Project at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Her publications include The Liberators, eyewitness accounts of the liberation of the concentration camps, the Oral History Manual, Mothers, Sisters, Resistors, Oral Histories of Women Who Survived the Holocaust, and Daring to Resist, Jewish Defiance in the Holocaust. Ms. Gurewitsch has been a leader in the fields of Holocaust research, archival preservation, exhibition presentation, and education. She has been a mentor to many, including myself. I am honored that she is joining us today. Our plan for today is as follows. Ms. Gurewitsch will speak for approximately 45 minutes to an hour, after which time we will invite questions from the teachers attending the program. We will be using the chat function for these teachers. We will end no later than 1:45 p.m. After the lecture today, we will send you a link to an online evaluation form. Please plan to spend a few minutes completing it. Your feedback is important to us, and I appreciate your taking this task seriously. I would like to take a moment now to thank the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany for funding today's program. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our Vice President for Education, Elizabeth Edelstein, who had an important role in presenting our program today. And I'd like to thank my intern, Blair Pincus, who helped prepare our PowerPoint. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the microphone over to Bonnie Gurewitsch. Bonnie?
Good morning, everyone. A special hello to Nancy Fisher on her special day. And we will get started telling the story of Jewish women in the Holocaust. A survey of the indexes of general Holocaust history books reveals few entries relating to women. Raoul Hilberg's original classic history contains 4 women's names. Lenny Yachil's history, another major work, mentions 11 women. I do not think there has been a deliberate attempt to omit women from Holocaust history. However, because historians often focus on leadership and on people whose impact on events appears in documentary sources, women, whose role in communal leadership was minimal in the Holocaust period, are generally absent from the historical record. Although women played important roles in the professions, they were rarely appointed to positions of leadership. The Nazi decree of September 21st, 1939, which ordered the appointing of Judenräte in occupied territory, specified that the Jewish council should be composed of 24 male Jews, preferably from, quote, the remaining influential personalities and rabbis, end quote. Women were important partners in Jewish resistance activities, serving as couriers who smuggled arms, food, and money, transferring information from one ghetto to another, and securing safe space for Jews trying to survive on the Aryan side. Yet very few women had leadership roles in Jewish resistance activities. Because the written historical record relies primarily upon written primary sources that emanate from official sources, we must learn about women's roles and their experiences from oral histories and memoirs of women historic Holocaust survivors. Women's experiences sometimes fill gaps in the historical record, informing us of circumstances and events not previously known. Next slide, please. For example, the interviews with Rose Meth, next slide, and Anna Heilman fill gaps in the story of how gunpowder was transferred to the men of the Auschwitz resistance before the prisoner uprising in Auschwitz. Next slide. The interview with Zenya Maletsky tells us what happened to Yitzhak Wittenberg. Next slide. A leader of the resistance in the Vilna ghetto in the 24 hours prior to his surrender to the Gestapo. Nazi ideology doomed all Jews, men and women equally. Jewish men and women experienced the Holocaust as Jews and responded to persecution within a Jewish religious, cultural, and historical framework. However, biology, culture, and history also create gendered responses. Nazi persecution affected men and women differently, often segregating them, impacting on their lives in different ways. Men and women interpreted and perceived their experiences differently and developed different coping mechanisms. Prevailing gendered social stereotypes caused different actions by persecutors and different reactions by men and women who struggled for survival. As Jewish families faced increasingly difficult conditions in Germany in the 1930s, it was the men who first bore the brunt of anti-Semitic persecution, and the women who had to cope with its effects. When men were dismissed from their jobs, their wives had to economize and improvise at home to feed and sustain their families. Women who had never worked outside the home sought outside employment, often at jobs that were far below their former social status. Next slide. Women set up and attended informal training courses that taught them marketable skills. Some learned millinery, corset making, or glove making. When Jewish men were arrested, it was often their wives who went to the police or the Gestapo to plead for their release, bribe officials, and arrange for their defense or for their emigration. As German Jewish men became powerless, their women not only assumed more responsibility, but provided the psychological and emotional support which sustained them as families and individuals. Children, too, relied upon their mothers for this support, first as they faced hostility from teachers, classmates, and playmates, and then when they were dismissed from their public schools for the crime of being Jewish. Perhaps because women were exposed to the manifestations of German anti-Semitism that impacted on their daily lives, and they had to cope with it on a day-to-day basis, they were more apt than men to take the initiative to move their family toward emigration. Men who were more likely to analyze political developments in theoretical terms were reluctant to admit that the Germany for which they had fought in World War I and where they felt culturally and intellectually at home was in the process of rejecting them. German Jewish men were accustomed to being rational decision makers in their families. Many could not believe that the Nazi madness would have fatal results until the pogrom of Kristallnacht, by which time it was too late for many to leave. The emigration process was often left to women to achieve, either because the men had already left or because the men had been arrested and emigration was a condition for their release. Women had to deal with government bureaucracy to obtain the proper documentation for emigration. As many as 30 documents were required. Women liquidated the family's assets, arranged for shipping their possessions, did the packing, and secured passage out of Germany. Some women risked their lives to smuggle valuables out, which would give them a start in their new lives. It was often impossible to arrange for an extended family to emigrate together. It was often a woman who remained behind, either to care for elderly parents or handicapped children who were not given emigration visas, to deal with the authorities to release imprisoned family members, or to pack the family possessions. As a result, more German men managed to emigrate than women. Because the men were in greater danger, women concentrated their efforts on freeing them. Women, particularly the elderly, remained in Germany in disproportionate numbers. An important factor influencing Jewish response to persecution in occupied territories was their memory of their experiences in World War I. Then, too, they experienced German aggression and occupation. However, they remembered the Germans as civilized occupiers who, in spite of bombardment, hunger, and forced labor, generally did not mistreat women and children. These memories led to a sense of false confidence in Eastern European Jews that occupation by Nazi Germany would be difficult, but not necessarily fatal. Because of prior experiences, Jewish men felt vulnerable and often fled from German areas of occupation, leaving the women and children behind. Next slide. When Rywka Diament escaped to Nice in the free zone of France, he sent for his family who had remained in Paris. Mrs. Diament's friends and neighbors thought she was crazy to attempt the trip alone with the children, crossing borders illegally. Who would take women and children, they asked, and advised her to stay in the safety of Paris. They could not imagine that the German occupiers would harm women and children. No one at that point realized that for the Nazis, all Jews were enemies. In many towns, the Nazis rounded up Jewish leadership and prominent businessmen soon after they occupied the town. Next slide. Shooting them nearby or deporting them to death camps. When Hannah Rigler's father was arrested and shot with 1,000 other prominent Jews of Shavli, his wife and 2 teenage daughters were left without a provider and protector. My father wasn't there, Hannah explains, and without the man, you were really nothing. Hannah's older sister did forced labor, and Hannah knitted an entire dress to earn a loaf of bread. Their mother, a university graduate, had no skills that were useful in the ghetto. The Rimmel family was expelled from Germany to Poland in the Poland, next slide, please, in the Poland Aktion, which preceded Kristallnacht. After her husband was deported to Auschwitz and killed, Mrs. Rimmel resorted to illegal commerce. When she was caught with merchandise by Germans who were looking for smugglers, she was imprisoned for 2 days until the Jewish community ransomed her from jail. Next slide. When she was released, 11-year-old Edith begged her, "Mother, Please don't do that anymore. What will we live on? Her mother responded. In most ghettos, only those who worked in registered enterprise were eligible for food rations, which were calculated at a level that would not sustain healthy life. Mothers had to share their rations with their young children who could not work. Braude Small's husband was caught in a roundup in the Lodz ghetto and never returned from work one day. In order to feed her child, she did piecework, braiding rags into carpets in order to receive a ration card for soup, which she would share with her daughter. Some ghetto roundups were directed specifically at children and the elderly, especially those who did not work. Rachel Silberman tells about the children's action in the Shavli ghetto, in which her niece and nephew were taken to their deaths. And Braude Small, next slide, describes how she protected her child from a similar action in Lodz. For survivors, these actions are traumas that are imprinted indelibly in their memories, epitomizing Jewish helplessness. In the Vilna region, there was not only a special roundup of children, but pregnancy was officially forbidden by a German order issued on February 5, 1942. Women who became pregnant were expected to have abortions. In Shavli, Rywka Diament disobeyed the orders. Successfully hiding her pregnancy, she gave birth in a dark closet, her mouth stuffed with rags to muffle any sounds. Had the act of childbirth been discovered, she, her husband, and the doctor who attended her would have been shot for their crime. Their baby boy was smuggled out of the ghetto to a kind protector. Miraculously, both parents survived and were able to retrieve their child after the war. In Vilna, a secret delivery room functioned in the hospital gynecology in the gynecology department at the ghetto hospital. The infants were hidden in a secret bunker in the hospital where they were nursed by their mothers. Later, their births were registered at the Judenrat as prior to the date of the ban. Some Jewish women had double responsibilities for both husband and children. Jewish men whose circumcision made it impossible for them to physically disguise their Jewish identity sometimes went into hiding. Their wives, usually blonde and blue-eyed, tried to pass as non-Jewish women, living and working in the Aryan community. Next slide. Sophie Billies left her daughter with her sister and Christian brother-in-law in a small Polish town. She put on a large crucifix and began to travel between the town and the Warsaw Ghetto. She smuggled into the ghetto food and documents obtained with the assistance of the village priest, therefore supporting herself and her child and assisting the Jewish underground in the ghetto. Hannah Bannett, next slide, left her husband in Jajany, Poland, bribing the German district commander to allow him to live and work as his gardener. She went to Krakow with their 2 children and eventually found work as a housekeeper for a high German official. Hannah almost betrayed her real identity and that of her children in a desperate attempt to assist her husband when he was betrayed and imprisoned. She did not know that he was already dead. When Helen Foxman gave her baby to the Polish maid, she lived with them as an aunt, never hinting at her true identity to the child, working nearby and providing food and money for her husband, who was hiding nearby in abandoned buildings. She considers it a miracle that the maid never followed her and never discovered her husband's hiding place. Next slide. In ghettos, Jewish community life was usually directed by men. In the Warsaw Ghetto, Dr. Anna Braude-Hellerowa retained her authority as chief of the children's hospital, but she was not a member of the Judenrat. None of the women listed in Isaiah Trunk's authoritative study of the Judenrats had positions of official responsibility. Vega Cherney was described by Trunk as the, quote, brains behind Moshe Meron in Sosnowitz, and Chaim Ruvkowski in Lodz, and an assistant who was described only as Miss Fuchs, a German deportee whose language skills were utilized by Ruvkowski in his dealings with the Germans. 4 other women are mentioned as secretaries to the heads of various Judenrate. The 2 notable exceptions, next slide, to women's role as background players in communal leadership. One was Gizi Fleischmann, a Zionist activist in Slovakia, former head of WIZO, who headed the Aliyah section of the Jewish Center that administered Jewish affairs in Slovakia. At the outbreak of the war, Fleischmann sent her own children to Palestine. From 1940 until 1944, she used her official status as cover for clandestine rescue activities and was also involved in negotiations with the Nazis to stop the deportation in exchange for goods and currency. In October 1944, she was deported to Auschwitz in one of the last transports of the war. She was gassed upon arrival. Next slide. Another woman who was active in rescue was Recha Sternbuch in Switzerland, who with her husband Isaac served as the Swiss representative of the Vaad Hatzalah. In addition to smuggling false documents into occupied territory, they were instrumental in arranging for the rescue of more than 1,700 Jews from Hungary on the Kostner train. Dr. Olia Goldfein in Pruzhany, Poland, was another exceptional woman. A prominent physician, she had served in a Moscow hospital in World War I and returned to Pruzhany, where she established a flourishing medical practice among both Jews and Christians. When Pruzhany was occupied by the Russians at the beginning of World War II, she was appointed director of the city hospital. Under German occupation, Dr. Goldfein was the member of the Judenrat responsible for medical services in the ghetto. She escaped from a deportation train and survived the Holocaust disguised as a nun and working as a nurse in a distant village, together with a nun whom she had once cured of a serious illness. Next slide. Other women were involved with Jewish educational activities in the ghettos, often in charge of children's homes or as teachers. Stefania Wilczynska, partner of the legendary Dr. Janusz Korczak in the Warsaw Ghetto, was a fine educator in her own right and influenced Korczak in his career as an educator. Like Korczak, she too accompanied the children of their orphanage to their deaths in Treblinka. Next slide. Genya Silkis was one of the many teachers in the Warsaw Ghetto. Next slide. Like Gertrud Groag in Terezin, she taught clandestine lessons to children who would not grow up to implement them. Malka Herbstman taught children who were deported to Transnistria. Their parents paid her in food, which was more precious than currency in the ghettos where most people starved or died of disease. In Krakow, the Beis Yaakov Teachers Seminary continued to function illegally as late as July 1942, giving young women skills which offered hope for the future. As long as Jewish communities existed, Jewish women were often able to improvise and sustain their families. However, deportation to concentration camps was the end not only of Jewish community life, but usually the end of Jewish family life. Women Women who were deported with their children were routinely murdered with them upon their arrival at the killing centers. Prisoners who worked on the arrival platforms would warn newly arriving women, give the children to the grandmothers, hinting that single younger women had a better chance of surviving the initial selection. Mothers and daughters who could pass the selection were sometimes able to remain together. Many pairs of mothers and daughters shared the concentration camp experience, sustaining each other and taking risks for each other as little families of women. Excuse me. As part of the deportation process, the local Nazi occupiers and their collaborators often confiscated jewelry and valuables, eager to acquire their share of Jewish property. As a gesture of resistance to this looting, Greek Jewish women in Salonika flushed their jewelry down the toilets of the buildings where they were being held prior to boarding the deportation trains. Other Jews buried family treasures before deportation. Those who survived usually found that these possessions had been dug up and looted by their former neighbors. There was no provision in concentration camps for biologically determined needs of women. Stripped of all their possessions, women were given either crude uniforms to wear or clothing confiscated from other prisoners that was too shabby to be shipped to Germany for German civilian use. Underwear was not issued. Bathroom facilities consisted of a latrine shack with a single water pipe whose use was severely restricted. There was no toilet paper. Tearing off a piece of one's uniform or blanket to use as a towel was considered sabotage, punishable by death. As a result of malnourishment and starvation, most women stopped menstruating. Maintaining a semblance of personal hygiene under these conditions was an act of resistance. Next slide. Ruth Mermelstein stole wire from the factory where she worked in Auschwitz and fashioned a crude comb, which she and her friends used to remove the lice from their hair. Some women washed with the liquid that they were given to drink in the morning. Other women traded their bread rations for items stolen from the Canada warehouses, like needles and thread, which they used to tailor improvements in their dress, giving them a better appearance and an advantage at the selections. The domestic skills that women brought to the concentration camps sometimes helped them and gave them an advantage. The testimonies of childbirth in concentration camps usually describe similar patterns of experience. Visibly pregnant women were usually gassed upon arrival at the death camps or removed from labor camps and transported to the extermination centers. To expose those whose pregnancies were hidden, women were enticed by the promise of additional food to step forward if they were pregnant. Next slide. Those who did were killed. Dr. Gisela Pearl tells of aborting pregnant women in Auschwitz. Most of the women who gave birth in the death camps were assisted by other prisoners, preferring to deliver in the barracks rather than in the medical blocks, which were known for medical experimentation and other atrocities. Women report that the infants were taken away, sometimes by the prisoners, sometimes by the guards. Almost none of the infants survived. Next slide, please. In addition to the remarkable story of the 7 babies born in Landsberg, I have read and heard of a few babies who survived after they were born in labor camps. Sometimes they were smuggled out and hidden with protectors. Sometimes births were so close to the time of liberation that the mothers succeeded in hiding the babies. However, these cases are rare exceptions. After liberation, where chaos reigned and all women were considered fair game by Soviet liberators, women took extraordinary measures to avoid rape. Next slide. Sonia, an older married woman, protected teenage Hannah Matuson, whom you see, by offering herself instead of the younger woman, whose earlier experiences with Russians are a series of narrow escapes from rape. Next slide. Sesha Brandstatter describes how she and her camp sisters, next slide, barricaded themselves with tables and chairs to prevent the Russians from entering their barracks. They violated the Sabbath, escaping by train, but the train was invaded by drunk Russian soldiers who had to be forcibly removed by an officer from the laps of the girls. One reaction that is uniquely feminine is the tendency of unrelated women to form close and long-lasting relationships that became a source of mutual assistance and strength. The term Lagerschwestern, camp sisters, was coined by women in concentration camps. It is unique to women. A parallel term describing male relationships as brotherly does not exist for men, indicating that while men may have been loyal to family members or friends and helped each other, they did not perceive the relationship either as brotherly or as unique to the camp experience. In my second lecture, I will explore the camp sister and blood sister relationship in greater depth. Under Nazi domination, women sometimes benefited from the stereotypes perpetrated by Nazi ideology, which relegated women to the spheres of child raising, the home, and religion. Kinder, Kirche, and Kirche. The persistence of the stereotype of the passive, homebound woman dominated by her husband prevented Germans from immediately suspecting women of activities that did not fit this stereotype. Next slide. When a German soldier discovered Nina Matatias nursing her baby in the little Greek village where the Matatias family was hiding, he was momentarily distracted from his search for partisans and Jews. "I have one like this in Germany," he said, retreating from her. In that moment, he responded to Nina Matatias purely as a mother, not as a Jew. As a mother, she was exempt from violence, but not as a Jew. Similarly, the capos who gave Miriam Rosenthal, next slide. Okay, go back, please. Extra food because of her pregnancy were also responding to her as a mother rather than as a less than human Jew. Because Jews had, over a period of centuries, developed successful means of accommodation to anti-Semitism and other more passive forms of resistance to it, Jews were generally viewed by Germans as too stupid and subjugated to resist their brutal occupation. Therefore, Jews did not immediately suspect Jews. Germans did not immediately suspect Jews of resistance activities, and Jewish women were suspected least of all. Jewish men, universally circumcised in a society that did not routinely circumcise male babies, were immediately identifiable. Jewish women, particularly those who had the Aryan features of blonde hair and blue eyes, were not physically identifiable as Jews. Eastern European Jews, who often had more secular education and more contact with non-Jewish neighbors than their men, would be slightly more familiar with Christian mores, which facilitated their assuming a false identity. Jewish women who passed as non-Jews were sometimes confronted with the same sexually threatening situations as non-Jewish women. However, where the situation involved the threat of disclosure of Jewish identity, the threat sometimes encompassed the Jewish women's family or resistance comrades as well. Jewish women who passed as non-Jews in order to protect their families were doubly threatened. Much depended on how they could carry off the charade. Marisha Warman was a courier for the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance Organization. Coming from an assimilated background, her Polish accent was flawless, and she was comfortable in non-Jewish surroundings. But as a woman, she had to contend with sexual threats, as well as the dangers that faced her as a courier. With quick thinking, she was able to turn a threat of sexual blackmail to her advantage by appealing for assistance from other Polish men, which protected her. Next slide. Warman and Dr. Adina Blady-Schweiger lived together on the Aryan side of Warsaw, providing money, documents, and safe living space for Jewish fugitives and resistance fighters from the ghetto. Next slide. Their room in this building was also a meeting place for resistance activities for resistance activists who brought flowers and played records when they came to visit their girlfriends. Schweiger noted that she and Marisha, quote, used to walk together and smiling and chatting like two young girls, just like all the other girls who filled the streets of Warsaw. But if one of us went out alone, she might forget herself and have, quote, sad eyes that betrayed the past within, end of quote. Jewish women were aware of the small advantage that they had as women, and some survivors refer to it explicitly. Yet this was not a crucial factor in the decision of some to join in resistance activities. They felt the need to do something, however small and however futile, to resist the Nazi evil. There is a conscious decision to do something right in the face of wrong, to behave consistently with the moral code in which they believed, regardless of the personal danger or the threat of death. Some felt that they would die anyway, that their chances of survival were so small that their gesture of resistance simply reinforced their own identities as sentient beings. Others felt that their efforts were intrinsically worthwhile. Perhaps they could contribute something that would help defeat the Nazis. None feel heroic. None feel that they deserve special credit. They all realized that in the larger pattern of the history of World War II, their actions probably had little influence on the course of the war. Yet they felt Yet they felt a sense of satisfaction that they took action, that they did what was right to the extent that they could. The women attribute their survival to luck or God's will, not to any qualitative advantage. All Jewish women, like all Jewish men, were earmarked for death. Only a fraction survived. I will explore Jewish women's physical and spiritual resistance in greater depth in my third lecture. Jewish women experienced the Holocaust as Jews and as women. The experiences cannot be separated. They understood their survival in the context of a history of Jewish persecution and survival, and in spite of it, they adapted to new responsibilities and experiences within the context of culture and biology. Social roles and stereotypes work to their advantage and disadvantage, working both for and against their survival. Drawing upon spiritual and physical resources, they struggled and persevered. Some prevailed. Thank you.
Bonnie, thank you so much for a really powerful lecture and bringing out such important material about these experiences of women. And I know that this is just a sample really that we could multiply these numbers by quite a lot. I'd like to open up now the chat. If anybody would like to ask any questions, now is a good time to do so. And I would like to, I hope that this is okay. I want to call out one of the teachers, actually the librarian at Magen David Yeshiva, Bruchi Weinstein, who says, Bonnie, thank you for giving my mother, Celia Brandstatter, a voice and a presence. Chassie Brandstatter.
It's my pleasure and privilege.
Thank you. So now let me ask you, so the information you have from this comes from oral histories?
Mostly from oral history, but some from personal memoirs. Like Adina Blady-Schweiger wrote a personal memoir, and I believe that the cover of her book is in the PowerPoint.
It is.
Likewise, Gisela Pearl, who actually, I believe, did give interviews because she survived, and I believe she worked at Mount Sinai Hospital, and then she made Aliyah and worked at Shaare Zedek. She also wrote a memoir. Where we had photographs of the women when they were young women, long before their interview, we used those photographs. But in other cases, we had a photograph only of the women from their interviews, such as Anna Heilman, and we used what we had.
Right. No, definitely good to know that. Okay, and I have here okay, here we go. Okay, we do have some questions coming in. One person asked if it's possible to share the PowerPoint or to make it available. Okay, we can talk about that. Here's another question. Here we go. In my mother's testimony about her experiences in Kovno ghetto and the Stutthof concentration camp and Death March, she references the important role of camp sisters, her many strategies to avoid rape by the Lithuanians at the 7th Fort and by the Russians to the liberation in Chinovia. So I know these are some of these things you're going to be addressing in subsequent lectures.
Right. For the women, the threat of rape was an astounding shock. Consider how they looked at liberation. They were emaciated. They were filthy. They were covered with lice. That Russians would want to rape them was inconceivable to them. But it was part of the spoils of war for the Russians, and they didn't care who the woman was. She was female, and that was her vulnerability.
Right. Okay, I have two more questions here. So one question is, do men mention and explain the actions of women at any length?
Explain the absence of women?
Yeah. So in other words, I'm just interpreting this question because I don't exactly know what the person who wrote it has in mind, but you know, in the literature written by men, in the memoir literature or the oral histories that you've done, do they also talk about what women have done?
Okay, first I'll deal with the survivors and then I'll refer to historians.
Okay, and I got that correct apparently.
Okay, so on the arrival platform at the concentration camps, at the main concentration camps, there was a selection by gender. Men and women were separated. And so the concentration camp experiences of men and women were separate because they had no contact. There are some exceptions to that. One of them is Terezin, where there was some contact. There was contact between men and women, and survivors of Terezin do mention, the males mention the women. Some people in concentration camps had jobs which let them move around the camp from one subcamp to another. Some were men and some were women. In the cases of those kinds of jobs, there was some contact between men and women. And in Auschwitz specifically, there was one woman, Rosa Robota, whose job was a runner. She took messages from the administration to various sections of the camp. And since she lived with the women, she was able to transfer gunpowder, which was stolen by the women in a factory. She was able to transfer it to the men when she got to the men's section of Auschwitz. These kinds of contacts were rare. In the camps, most people did not have contact with members of the opposite sex. Historians, on the other hand, generally rely on official documents to write their oral history, to write their histories. It is only in the last 10 years, I would say, that historians have begun to use the oral histories and memoirs of women. And so the situation has changed for the better, I think. And now current history has been taking advantage of the very rich resources in oral histories and in personal memoirs. And so the last books written by Christopher Browning, for example, a very well-known and highly respected historian, have actually used oral histories of women. In his book on the factories at Szkarzysko Kamienna, he actually came to the Museum of Jewish Heritage and watched and listened and read the oral histories of the women we have from those camps. And he did a comprehensive survey of oral histories of women who worked in those camps. So that situation is changing, and I'm very pleased about that.
Thank you for the answer. We have a few more questions coming in, so let me try, or comments. So let me try to share those with you. Okay, so Evelyn Orkabi, who's one of our gallery educators and is the daughter of Ruth Mermelstein, spoke with her mother just now, and she says that she doesn't remember using the comb to remove lice, but she says she kept it solely because she hoped to survive and have hair again, and said that certainly it's her personal resistance. So, but anyway, so that was just a comment. Okay, now we have a few, I just want a lot of great questions here. So I want to make sure that I can hit them all. Will you be sharing any information about camp brothels or the role of women who were working in them?
It is very rare that Jewish women were chosen to serve in the camp brothels. And since my lectures focus on Jewish women, I do not address that issue.
Okay, thank you.
Someone who does address that issue is Rochelle.
Is it Seidman?
No. First, no. I'll get her name to you. Her book on Ravensbrück addresses that. and she does address it in other writings. Her name just flew out of my head, but I might remember it. And if not, I will email it to Paul. But so sorry about that. Okay.
And not a problem. I've got more questions.
Seidel. Okay. Seidel.
Seidel.
Seidel. Saidel. If you look up her writings, she does deal with the brothels.
Okay. So a few more questions. Are there any studies of Jewish women in the forced labor camps in Siberia during the war?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Here's another question. Menstruation ceasing because of malnutrition and starvation. Have you also come across mention of Nazis using other methods to stop menstruation of women in the camps?
Okay. There is a myth that was created during the First World War that the Nazis put a chemical in people's food to make them weak, and the women considered that that also included stopping menstruation. They called it bromine, and the women thought that it would stop, that it stopped menstruation. There is no validity. That is a myth. There's no validity to that idea. And there have been studies on starvation, and it is known that starvation will cause cessation of menses, and that is the medical explanation. Why would the Nazis have cared if women menstruated or not? They didn't care if women didn't have toilet paper. So why would they have cared if women menstruated or not?
Right, of course. Here's another comment, actually, and a question. This was a beautiful tribute to the courage of women in the Holocaust. Thank you. Can you speak a bit more about Recha Sternbuch and her organizational skills?
Recha Sternbuch worked together with her husband, Isaac Yitzchak, and she was a powerhouse of organizational skills, totally fearless. She stepped into the lion's den and spoke to very high-ranking Nazis, including Goebbels' personal representative. She was willing to say anything that she felt might influence them to cooperate with her rescue plans. We will never know whether it was the Sternbuch's influence or other influences entirely beyond that and outside of that stopped the deportations in Czechoslovakia in 1942. There was a 2-year hiatus in those deportations. We will really never know what really had the impact. But the fact is that she did work on those rescue plans, and at least the Kostner train got through. She was a religious woman. Her hair was covered, her sleeves were long, she dressed modestly, and yet she spoke with the force of her convictions and had tremendous influence. And I think that the fact that she was a woman and endangering herself and taking those kinds of initiatives was so surprising that it kind of reduced the risk for her when she did negotiate with Nazis. They were not accustomed to that kind of a Jewish woman. Also, the two of them were the representatives of the Joint Distribution Committee in Switzerland, and they had access to funds. So she had money to play with and to back up her requests. And that was also a very important part of her ability to negotiate. She could put her money where her mouth was to a degree. Didn't have as much money as they demanded, never did, but she had some money and that was helpful.
Thank you. I got one or two more questions here. And I don't know if you probably won't have an answer to this, but here goes. How many of the babies born in the camp survived, and how were they hidden from the guards?
Okay, the 7 babies who were born in Kaufering, Landsberg, were born between January and Purim, which was March. They were not hidden. It was a crazy, peculiar episode. And all 7 babies and all 7 mothers survived. I know specifically of 2 babies who were born in Auschwitz and were hidden. I don't know the details. And I've heard rumors of others, but I cannot imagine that there were many, maybe 5, maybe certainly less than 10.
Okay, thank you.
I know about how there was one baby, I mentioned a baby who was born in a closet in Shavli. That baby was smuggled out by his father. He was put in a basket covered with food and smuggled out to a Christian woman who had agreed to hide him. The go-between was a priest, and she hid him, and he survived until the end of the war. And I knew the mother. I went to school with her, and I met the son, the one who was born, and he actually lent some of the artifacts that were in that basket. In addition to food, there were all sorts of beautiful linens, hand-embroidered linens, that were given to the Christian woman as payment for hiding the child. And some of the linens survived, and we actually displayed them in the resistance exhibition that we mounted.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just looking at there's a couple, well, 1 or 2 more questions here. One is just, would you repeat the name of the Czech woman who stepped into the lion's den? I'm not sure what she's referring to, but.
That's Gizi Fleischman.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I spell it?
Sure.
Gisi, that's her first name. It's a diminutive of Gisela, but she was called Gizi. And Fleischman is Fleischmann.
Oh, okay. And actually, the next question is, could you please elaborate more on Gizi Fleischman's role in rescue work? Is it true that she allowed the Nazis to have a telephone because they valued her, she was allowed by the Nazis to have a telephone because they valued her usefulness?
Okay, it was not just that she was useful. Gizi Fleischman was the head of WIZO, that's the Women's Zionist Organization in Slovakia. And one of the deceptive tactics of the Nazis was that they allowed certain Jewish communal organizations to continue functioning until the massive deportations began. That was the case in France, where the Jewish consistoire was allowed to continue functioning and their employees were allowed to continue working. And that was the case in Slovakia, which was an ally of Nazi Germany until the Nazis took over in 1944. So Gizi Fleischman was essentially part of the Jewish leadership establishment in Slovakia, and as a means of deceiving the Jewish community into thinking that they could survive because they had a Jewish community, she was allowed to continue her work. So it was not just that she was a remarkable, charismatic person, but that the context allowed her and other Jewish leaders to continue functioning as Jewish leaders. And so they were protected from deportation or immediate execution for their job because it was part of their job, which was allowed. She was charismatic. She was very emphatic in her work. She knew exactly what she wanted to do. She did a lot of stuff that was so-called illegal, with hiding children and smuggling people out of Czechoslovakia into Romania, where they could get out of Nazi-occupied territory. She was very active. There is a good biography of her. Something about in the lion's den or in the mouth of the lion, something like that. But you could Google Gizzy Fleischman and the book will pop up. There's only that one biography, which was actually written by a non-Jewish woman. So the effectiveness of Gizzy Fleischman's work was for two reasons. One, that she was allowed to keep working, and second, that she didn't let anything stand in her way. And eventually, she was deported. She was deported in one of the very last deportations from Slovakia, and she was given a note, a sealed note, to hand to the person who was doing the selection. And that note instructed the person who did the selection to make sure that she was executed, and she was gassed.
Thank you. Okay, well, I think we have time for one last question, so let me go ahead and read this one here. Please talk about the 4 women who smuggled gunpowder to make explosives.
Okay, that was Rosa Rabota was the courier. I hope I remember all 4 names. Anna Heilman was one of them. Okay, I apologize. I do not remember the names of the other 3 women. Senior moment. The 4 women worked in a section of Auschwitz called the Union Factory. That's where they filled, and the women themselves filled the detonation caps that were put on certain bombs, that were on certain rockets, like the V1 or the V2 rockets. Those were the caps that they filled. Those women did 2 kinds of sabotage. One is that they tried to underfill the cap, or not to close it properly, or to try to dent it in some way. There was a supervisor whom they called the Meister, who examined their work very carefully, but in spite of that, they tried to sabotage those caps. Another way that they did sabotage was that they would steal tiny little bits of gunpowder and roll them up, put them in tiny little bits of rag or paper, whatever they could steal, and they would put them in the pocket of the uniform or the dress that they were wearing. And Rosa Rabota would collect those little bits of gunpowder and transfer them to the men of the Auschwitz resistance. They were the men who worked in the Sonderkommando, those people who worked in the gas chamber, putting people in and taking corpses out. And they were the ones who mounted the resistance in 1944, and they actually they also were getting gunpowder from other sources. So this was not the only source of gunpowder. It wasn't terribly much, but for them, it was a way of fighting back. And they did manage to destroy one gas chamber and set a fire in a second gas chamber. And as a result of that uprising, where all the men were killed, shortly after that, they actually stopped the gassing in Auschwitz. And that's when they sent people out on death marches.
Thank you. Actually, one of the attendees noted that a couple of the names of the other women, Alla Gertner and Sala Kirshner.
Right.
And there is one follow-up question, so it's not exactly a new question. I just want to ask this while we're still here, which was, did the Nazis tap all the phones given to the Jewish communal leaders? And why did Gizzy Fleischman, why did she give that note?
Why did she what?
Why did Gizzy Fleischman give the sealed note to the person doing the selection?
She didn't know what was in it. And she was there already. Her children were gone. You know, they were in Palestine, they were safe. She had done her job. No, maybe there was a kind of fatalism about that. I'm not actually positive that she was given the note. Maybe some German official was given the note. I know that there was a note with instructions to make sure that she was gassed. I'm not positive that she was given that note. I could be wrong.
Okay, thank you. Bonnie, thank you so much for really a magnificent lecture and for the wonderful Q&A that we just had. And this is a really great introduction to the next two lectures, which I know we'll be doing, talking about Camp Sisters and about Jewish identity. And I want to thank you again for this. I'd like to thank all of the participants today for joining us. I got a lot out of it. I hope you did as well. Please don't forget to complete the evaluation form. Again, thanks to Elizabeth Edelstein and to Blair Pincus for their help in behind the scenes making this happen. And I want to wish everybody a good afternoon. So
Thank you for your good questions.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.